Warning: for those who are easily affected by stories featuring animals, please be advised that the following story may not be for you. There's nothing gruesome in the story, but let's just say you've been warned. I worked as a volunteer fire lookout in the Midwest of the United States. It was something I did for fun. I enjoy helping people, and I also enjoyed the outdoors. So when I learned that the local Forest Service needed some help, I quickly volunteered. Every other weekend for that summer, I was stationed at a fire lookout tower that stood in a small clearing on top of a medium-sized hill. It was the perfect vantage point, allowing me to see for miles in every direction. By my 7th stay there, I hadn't even seen so much as a smokestack from a campfire. Needless to say, by that point, I wasn't very worried about spotting any fires, but I was still attentive. Now, when you're out in the middle of the woods, stationed alone, and you stay overnight for 2 days, it can be extremely creepy. You hear some rather eerie things in the woods at night, things you struggle to place rationally, so you tend to ignore them. But this story isn't about strange, unexplained things. Sadly, this story is about people, some of the worst kind. It was on my 7th stay, on the 2nd day, which would have been Sunday, around the early afternoon. I was messing with the knob on the radio. I had accidentally skipped over the first talk show I'd heard in weeks, and I was trying to find it again, because I was tired of hearing random radio stations blasting music. That's when I heard something coming from outside. There were a few different voices, laughing and shouting, followed by a smaller voice, like a distressed animal, something that was desperate and in pain. I walked onto the deck, the platform area that surrounds the shelter of the tower, and there, in the clearing below me, were 3 kids and a puppy. The kids looked to be 16 or 17 years old. They were shouting and laughing and seemed to be teasing the poor puppy, which I think was a small husky. The poor thing was extremely scared of the 3 boys, looking like it knew what they were about to do. The boys themselves had encircled it and were stomping toward it in quick motions, as if trying to make it jump or flinch. The puppy's tail was between its legs, and it had no idea where to go or how to escape that situation. One of the boys walked away for a moment, then came back from the tree line with a very thick branch in his hand. He was wielding it like a club, and he looked like he was about to use it on the dog. I quickly climbed on the ladder. I wasn't going fast enough, so I jumped down halfway. The moment I hit the ground, the kids saw me. Apparent from their looks, I don't think they knew that this fire lookout tower was occupied. "What do you think you're doing?" I said to them. No, I was expecting them to react the way kids do to adults. Give me that rebellious face of knowing they'd been caught. But these kids, they were different, and it really creeped me out. They smiled toothy grins, as if they were glad they now had someone to witness what they were about to do. One of them, the tallest of the bunch, spoke up. "What do you think we're about to do? This mutt was just going to pass away in the shelter anyway. Might as well make it of use." He gestured toward the puppy, which was so scared now that it was shaking. What did he mean, make use of it? How is hurting it making use of anything? I pulled out a taser in my back pocket. It's a pretty heavy-duty one, as thick as my forearm, and any passerby would think it was military grade or something. I showed it in front of myself, and I said to them, "You guys better get home and leave that dog here unless you want to get hurt and be unconscious when the cops arrive." This seemed to really tee them off. Their smiles vanished, and the one with the club really looked like he wanted to use it on me. Then I looked at the tall one, and he was looking at the guy with the stick and shaking his head, giving him a nonverbal cue. This was weird. They did not act like kids. They did not act like teenagers up to no good. The tall one looked back at me, then said, "Whatever, take the stupid thing." He then gestured for the other 2 to follow him out of the woods, but before they broke the tree line, he turned back to me and shouted, "It's not my fault if you get hurt." Hurt? Was that a threat? It didn't matter. I'd be leaving for home in the morning, and the puppy was safe now. When they were gone, I put the taser away back in my pocket, then I walked up to it. It started yelping again, obviously having no trust in anything that looked human. Poor thing had probably never met a nice person in its life, but I wanted to show it otherwise. I've always believed most people are good, and I wanted to show this puppy that. It was shaking, its tail between its legs still, and scooting itself backward in a sitting position as I approached it. But it let me pick it up, and once I did, I began to pet it and hold it close, trying to gain its trust, trying to make sure it knew that it was okay now. Not 30 seconds after picking it up, the little baby started rubbing on me. He looked desperate for love. It brought a tear to my eye to see this, and I wondered, how long had those stupid kids been hurting this poor dog? I climbed back up the ladder carefully with the dog in one hand. Once I made it up to the platform, I quickly fed the dog some food, which was really just half a Slim Jim and some Frito bean dip. It was all I had at the moment. I wasn't really expecting company. I turned on the radio, never managing to find that talk show again, so we played some country music, the classic stuff, the old Reba and Tim McGraw stuff. All the while, that little gray puppy was absolutely annihilating the can of bean dip and had nearly swallowed the Slim Jim whole. It was starving. I scratched its ear before it quickly rolled over on its back, wanting a tummy rub. That's when I noticed she was a girl, and she had a little bit of a flea problem. "No worries," I said. "We'll take care of that when we get home." As I scratched her tummy, it was then that I realized I was taking this little girl with me, and she was going to be a part of my family. A part of my family I didn't know I wanted, didn't know that I needed. And it didn't take too long to figure out a name for her. Sophie. A name as pretty as she was cute. When the sun was beginning to set, I climbed back down the ladder with her to see if she wanted to do her business. While we were down there, I tried to get her to chew on some sticks or see if she would fetch them. She wasn't too great at fetch. It was more like, you throw that stick, and I'm keeping, which was okay by me. As I was climbing back up the ladder with her, after playing down there for about 20 minutes, I began to hear shouting coming from the trees. The voice sounded familiar. It was that kid. I rolled my eyes, climbed up the ladder, and began to pull it up so that they couldn't get to us. These kids were trouble, and I was not risking it. I see the three figures of the kids from before. They're coming from the tree line. When they get into the view of the setting sun, I see that they're now wearing masks, creepy-looking animal masks. It was so bizarre and out of place, I found myself wondering how close to Halloween it was. "I thought I told you to go home," I shouted down to them. They stared at me, motionless. 10 seconds went by without another word before the tall one once more spoke up, his voice partially muffled behind the goat mask. "I told you, you started this. All we needed was something to give, and you took it from us. Now we have nothing to give, and we want it back." I was more confused now and a little bit worried. So they wanted the dog back, and that means they were ready to take it by force. I began to wonder if they had brought weapons. I didn't say anything back. They couldn't get up in this tower if they wanted to. I took Sophie inside the enclosure of the platform, where the bed and the radio were, and we settled in for the night. But that didn't really affect the kids outside. They were shouting all night. Sometimes they simply moaned and bleated like animals, while other times they were shouting threats and describing what they wanted to do to me. Yes, I radioed this in, and I was told that a patrol car would be by in an hour or so. But the thing is, the patrol car never made it. And when I saw, after that hour, that they didn't show up, I contacted someone over the radio again, and they told me that the cop got lost, and they would be there as soon as possible. Well, soon wasn't soon enough. Now, with the ladder hidden away, and the kids having no way to get into the tower, I held Sophie close, and we eventually fell asleep together, in my little cot. Cop or no cop, we'd be fine, and would just have to wait these guys out. I woke up after sunrise. The radio said it was about 9 a.m. I had overslept. I rubbed the sleep out of my eyes and turned over. I noticed Sophie was gone. Figuring she had just jumped out of the bed, I looked under it. She wasn't there. I looked all around the enclosure, but she was gone. I noticed that the door to the enclosure was partially open. Fear filled me as I realized that she may have walked off the edge of the platform and gotten hurt. I ran out and over to the edge. She wasn't on the ground anywhere, and she wasn't anywhere on the platform. I quickly threw the ladder back down, and I began to climb down the platform, but halfway down, I noticed something. A sickly feeling flooded my stomach as I realized where Sophie was. There were holes punched in the beams of the tower, and there were grooves in the holes, as if something metal had twisted itself into them. These holes led all the way from the bottom to the top of the platform. Those kids. They had climbed up while I was sleeping. I don't know how they managed to do it without waking me, but they took Sophie. It's hard to describe the feeling of sadness, loss, and anger that I felt in that moment. Making my way down the tower, I searched the woods for about 2 hours before I made my way to where I parked my car. I would report this to the cops in person myself, but I knew deep down that it would be too late. Anything that could be done might not be done, and if it could get done, it would be far after those kids did what they wanted to my Sophie. The patrol car that I was promised the night before never showed up, and eventually gave up from finding the tower. And when I reported the incident to the cops, the most that came of it was a single lineup, but all the kids they showed in the lineup did not match who I saw that day. I never saw Sophie again, and I know those kids did something to her, that poor thing. She didn't deserve that. During the spring of 2014, I served as a volunteer fire lookout for my local national park. I was told it would look very well on my application to be a forest ranger, which in the area I lived in was highly competitive. There weren't many spots to be forest rangers, but every guy I grew up with wanted to be one. We grew up loving the outdoors, so I can't say I blame them. This was basically our dream job, and I was doing whatever it took to get the extra advantage over them. Anyway, I managed to talk my way to be a 2-week-long volunteer at the local fire lookout. It was stationed in a sparse set of woods. There wasn't much wildlife there, so I figured it'd be easy. If something did happen, I would see it from a mile away, literally. I was excited about it, didn't really bring any forms of entertainment during my stay, because the wilderness was entertainment enough. But it was on the very first night that the horror began. You see, I had nightmares every night, multiple nightmares of the same thing, only changed in different ways sometimes. The nightmare was about the forest remaining silent while the lookout tower burned to ash. Sometimes I was in the fire, and I would burn up with it, and I could feel every searing pain from the blaze. Other times I was standing outside of the tower, on the ground, looking up at it, as it burned away to nothing but a pile of ash. But whenever the nightmare came, and it was from the perspective of me on the ground, I could see someone in the tower. It looked to be a man, roughly in his late 30s, and as the flames took him, he didn't budge. Instead, his figure would be still and look down at me from the burning tower. This was literally a nightly occurrence, and no matter what sleeping pills I took, what calming noises or exercises I used, the nightmares always came to me. Those 2 weeks were basically the worst of my life. I got barely any sleep. Nightmares began to bleed into reality. At one point I even woke up screaming before running down the tower, only managing to realize halfway down that the fire wasn't actually real. Finally, the last day came. I was sitting on the steps waiting for someone to pick me up. One of the rangers, who had promised to take me back to my car after my volunteer service was over. They showed up at around noon, and the first thing the guy said was, "Whoa, you look like you haven't slept in weeks." So apparently my stress was pretty obvious. I climbed into the Arctic Cat he was driving, and we began to make our way down a bumpy forest trail. He asked me how it was, and if I enjoyed my stay at the lookout. With tired eyes, I simply nodded. When it grew quiet again, I felt compelled to tell him about the nightmares. "It was strange, man," I said, then yawned. Kept having this nightmare, same one every night. The tower would keep getting burned down in flames, and I saw someone standing in the tower. I think he told me his name once too. Something like Dave, I think. It was awful. I don't think I got much sleep, to be honest. After I explained this to him, he stopped the Arctic Cat and he looked at me. That's not very funny. For someone wanting volunteer hours, that's a pretty disrespectful thing to say. Apparently I'd offended him. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Don't look at me like that. There's no way you'd know that unless someone told you about the fire, so that's not a very funny joke you just tried to pull." "Look," I said, "I don't know about any fire. What are you talking about?" He told me the story. He must be finally believing me after seeing the look in my eyes. Apparently, they'd lost a ranger in the fire. A fire that destroyed the tower once, and it had to be rebuilt in that spot. The ranger's name was also David. As we drove back to the parking lot in front of the ranger station, I did not believe that story and thought it was a prank he pulled on me. But when I questioned the other rangers at the station before going home, they all concurred. The story was real, and I realized, with a painful feeling in my stomach, a feeling like dread, that my nightmares were something more than just nightmares. I was going on my first solo backpacking trip. I had even called ahead to the ranger station to confirm that there was water near where I planned to camp, and they said there was. I arrived at the trailhead around 6 a.m. on a sunny Tuesday. I wasn't the only car at the trailhead, but the Monument 83 trailhead is shared by the more popular Monument 78, the Canada end of the Pacific Crest Trail, so it's to be expected. I hoisted on my 35-pound backpack and set out on the 9.6-mile hike. 6.5 miles in, I passed a creek. But as I was previously told there would be water at the top, I didn't refill my bottles just yet. The road trail ended, and the real trail started. This trail was now much steeper, and I was drinking more water than I should have been. I arrived at the Monument 83 fire lookout with just 2 cups of water left and no water source nearby. I walked in several directions, but neither found nor heard any water. I changed my plans to stay back at the creek after a break at the lookout. I then noticed that the door to the lookout was open already, and I could hear voices coming from inside. Now the lookout is for emergencies only, but since this was the year of the Farewell Creek fire, and the entire sky to the southeast was black with smoke, I assumed someone was there staffing it. I called out for permission to climb the tower, but I did not get a response. I soon realized it wasn't voices I was hearing, but a radio repeater, and I thought that maybe the last people to visit the lookout had failed to close the door. I climbed up the tower, but the trap door to the catwalk was closed. It wasn't locked, but it simply wouldn't budge, which meant that something was blocking it. I realized whoever was actually in the lookout likely did not have the permission to be there, and even more so, probably wasn't friendly. Then I heard the sound, help, before a sudden stomp was heard above me, and it was quiet once more. I became as quiet as possible as fear raced through me. It dawned on me I was a solo female hiker, unarmed, on a deserted trail nearly 10 miles from the road. I immediately left. I turned back only once, and I swear I saw someone standing and staring out at me, a silhouette of someone. I stopped at the water source to fill my bottles. I had been rationing water for a while now. I had run out of water before making it here, and I ended up guzzling about 4 cups. I drank too quickly and immediately felt nauseous. I sat there in the log while my stomach forcefully accepted the water and tried to figure out where to pitch my tent. As the nausea faded, the fear soon replaced it. I couldn't stay out here. I had to get back. I had to get out of the forest and away from that lookout, and whoever was up there could be at my camp in moments if they wanted to be. That is, if they weren't watching me from somewhere right now. I imagined being awakened to my tent unzipping, and knew I would not be strong enough to fight off an attacker. I quickly ran back to the truck. I ended up hiking 20 miles in one day with a full backpack. I stayed at a nearby campground and nursed my silver dollar-sized blisters. I had never been more exhausted. I'm not sure anything would have happened to me, but everything about that situation felt wrong, and I'm glad I trusted my gut. But who was in the lookout, and why did they silence the person who was crying for help? I grew up in northern Saskatchewan, Canada, in the tiny Dene First Nation band of Black Lake, which sits on a lake of the same name. I'm Métis, which in Canada means some of my family is of European ancestry, my mom's side, and some of my family are First Nations, my dad's side, who are Dene. Because of my dad, I grew up with a love of the outdoors. He took me hunting in the endless acres of forest that surrounded our tiny town. Reservations are rough places to grow up in the best of times, so I was happy to escape the depression and rampant alcoholism of the reserve by using my dad's crossbow to stalk the many deer and moose that lived in the woods. Most of the time, I didn't even bag anything. I just went to enjoy nature and listen to the wind whistling in the evergreen woods. One day after a particularly rough day in school in the mid-fall, when the first flurries of the oncoming Canadian winter were beginning to come down, I grabbed my dad's crossbow with his permission, and I trekked out down my street into the woods. A smile crossed my face as I ducked under the fallen pine tree I usually pass as I went hunting. I needed this. I was ready for this. Slowly, the distant sounds of the community faded away, and I was left with the ambient bird sounds and the rustling of small squirrels and chipmunks. I followed the little-known path to my makeshift deer stand that I had made with my dad, a small platform latched to a tree by a creek bank that drained into the nearby lake. I was about 8 feet off the ground with a small stepladder leading up to it. The entire platform was part of an old fire lookout structure that my dad had bought on the cheap from the province. It was about 2 kilometers down that path that I had been walking on. And when I got there, I pulled myself up the stepladder onto the platform and made myself comfortable, scanning the riverbank silently for any deer coming down for a drink from my vantage point on the old fire lookout. After a few hours, it became clear today wasn't going to be my day. So I took a lighter from my pocket, stuffed some kindling into an old coffee pot that I kept at the FIREWATCH tower, and lit a small campfire to ward off the chill of the evening fall air. As I sat there, crossbow across my lap, and enjoying the warmth of my little blaze, I felt myself dozing off a little, letting the flurries melt on my warm tongue. But then I heard a sound that snapped me instantly awake and completely on guard. Down below me I heard the distinct sniffing and huffing sound, which in these woods only meant one thing: a bear. Now we get grizzlies and black bears aplenty up here in the north, and this sounded like an enormous grizzly, hungry and smelling for food. I mentally cursed at myself for lighting that fire, probably drawing the thing to me, and I stamped it out with my combat boot. I raised my crossbow toward the edge, braced it with my boot, then pulled the string back until it made an audible click as it locked into place. Then the sniffing suddenly stopped, and I held my breath. I knew then, after a chill of fear went over me, that the bear now knew where I was. Almost as soon as the thought crossed my mind, the bear reared up on its back legs, and my heart skipped a beat. I mentioned earlier that the platform is raised 8 feet off the ground, but a grizzly can get to be 9 feet tall, though I've heard it was rare, only ever getting that big in the wilds of Alaska and the Yukon. So my heart dropped when this bear, standing on its back legs, easily towered over me, head and shoulders above the lip of the platform. It must have been easily 10 or 11 feet tall. It also looked nothing like a normal grizzly. Its fur was a dark gray, with light gray areas around the eyes that made it almost look like an owl. It had a much shorter snout than most bears, and its eyes were yellow instead of the typical brown you see. Its jaw was agape, massive things protruding from its mouth. It stared at me for a moment before its jaws yawned, and it roared, so long and loud that it made my ears ring. I screamed, pulled the trigger of the bow, and in the blink of an eye, the bolt buried itself in the beast's arm. It all happened so fast and in a panic. I watched the beast stagger back and sort of scream, and then it locked its eyes on mine. In that instant, I knew I made a huge mistake. I'd only angered it more, simply injured it. It raised a massive garbage can lid-sized paw and swiped at the logs holding the platform, causing part of it to buckle. Logs flew in every direction as I tumbled out of the tree, falling almost head first into the creek next to the platform. I fell into the water, hitting my head on a log and seeing stars. In the chaos and confusion, the crossbow had fallen from my grasp and I was unarmed now, except for my pocket Swiss Army knife. I pushed past the pain and surfaced, gasping, ready to face the bear, the massive gray bear that was sure to be stalking the bank. I saw it, leaning its massive head over the bank, pawing the water with huge claws. It was looking for me. With a yell, I kicked back as it splashed its paws through the water. I was fighting for my life, but my mind was more clear than ever. It was like my body was on autopilot, doing what it had to fight back. I began to kick and swim my way downstream, riding the rapids and staying as far away from the bear as I could. It followed me from the bank, glaring at me on occasion with those yellow eyes to make sure it knew where I was. It was waiting to see where I ended up, waiting for me to wash ashore and devour me. Whenever I'd get too close to the bank, it would once more swipe at the water with those enormous paws. Luckily, I was just out of reach, ended up being long enough that the bear eventually just stopped. The last I saw of it, the bear was standing on its hind legs, leaning up against a tree, as if thinking to itself that I wasn't worth the long pursuit. The next thing I knew, I was waking up after having apparently passed out in the water, and luckily I hadn't drowned. I was on the shore, dizzy but alive. I carried myself to the nearest road, where an older man passing by in his truck stopped and took me to the hospital. I was treated for hypothermia and a severe concussion. When my dad showed up and I was conscious again, I told him my story. At first he didn't believe me, but the more I insisted, the more convinced he became. So yeah, I was attacked by the most bizarre-looking bear you'd ever see. But I survived, and I'm here to tell you something you probably already know. When it comes down to it, and nature targets you as its next victim, there's not much you can do but pray and fight for your life. I haven't gone back to the old and now destroyed fire lookout, but I don't want to either. I don't want to cross paths with that hungry bear. I live in the northern part of Sweden, in the countryside, a good distance away from the bigger cities. I work as a harvester and forwarder operator with 2 colleagues, and if you don't know what it is, it's a big piece of red machinery that harvests timber. When it's summertime, the ground gets really dry, and there's a large risk that the machine's chains and tracks could grind up towards a rock and spark a quick and bad fire. So on that particular day, I was working as a FIREWATCH for that company, making sure nothing went ablaze, and if it did, I'd be the first to respond and make sure it didn't get too bad. I had an ATV equipped with a fire extinguisher and water tanks on the back to help put fires out. Anyway, it was around early noon, and my coworkers were driving around. I was standing in a makeshift lookout tower. It gives us a great view of the entire lot, so we don't miss a single spark. To my right was the logging road with all the timber stacked up, and to my far left is the newly exposed tree line. Anyway, I was just observing the machines when I got the sudden urge to look to my left. I don't know why, but I went ahead and listened to that weird gut feeling. I didn't see anything at first, trees swaying in a heavy summer wind. I scanned the tree line again and again, intensely, something inside me telling me that I was missing something. Again, I really didn't know why. And then I spotted it. There was something behind a medium-sized boulder, a tall dark shadow. At first I thought it was an old rotten tree or something, so I started my ATV and proceeded to approach it. And the closer I got to it, the more nervous I got. When I was about 50 meters away, I could start to make out the shapes better. As I said before, all I knew was it was tall and dark, maybe 3 meters in height. It appeared to have arms, but it was really hard to see, but I felt obligated to approach it more. If it was an animal, it was unlike anything I'd ever seen, and I would be overcome with curiosity. If it was a person, they were trespassing and could get hurt around the large machinery. Either way, I had to approach. I was really scared at this point, the entirety of my being telling me to turn around and get the heck out of there. I stared at the shape intensely for about a minute, waiting for it to move, and suddenly it did. It shrunk away down behind the rock. It happened so suddenly, after not moving for so long, that it made me jump. Now I was a bit skeptical, thinking it was someone just messing with me, so I turned off my ATV and started to walk towards it. When I got there, I took slow and quiet steps and started to peer around the rock, but there was nothing, and this made me even more creeped out. I hadn't heard anyone run away, didn't see any footprints or any disturbance in the vegetation, no sign that what I saw physically existed. I slowly turned around and ran back in a panic to my ATV, kind of like how you run out of the basement after turning off the light. There's nothing down there, but you still feel the panic from the dark. I later told my coworkers what I saw, but they think I was playing a prank on them. I wish it was a prank. I wish I had more answers. Every time I have the FIREWATCH duty now, I keep an all too close eye on that tree line, always expecting the figure to lean out from the rock again, but I haven't seen it since. Nowadays, that whole area freaks me out. Sometimes protecting nature and the community can be very scary and hard work. Not only do you have to keep a keen eye out for fires that could ruin everything around them, you also have to keep an eye out for the strange and terrifying things that lurk in the woods. Things like insidious people, the supernatural, and vicious, starving wildlife. So if you work as FIREWATCH or volunteer for it, thank you and good luck. Good night. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video.